Welcome to Naked Reflections, brought to you from the Wolf Institute. I'm Ed Kessler, and each week I'll be taking an in-depth look at the stories reported by our friends over at the Naked Scientists. What does the latest scientific stuff mean for the rest of us? Stay with us and find out. I relate musical keys to tastes. The key of G is fruity, and G minor is a slightly bitter beer. That was the intriguing observation of a listener to a recent Naked Neuroscientist podcast. It's more common, though still unusual, to link musical keys to different colours. That's known as synesthesia. If these things seem odd, mixing up tasting, listening and looking, it's worth remembering that our perception of colour considered on its own is by no means straightforward. What the eye delivers to the brain, the mind then interprets. That's our subject this week, the colours in our minds. Professor Anja Halbert is a leading expert in this field and spoke on the Naked Neuroscientist podcast.
We respond to light coming off objects in order to see objects, but we also respond to light itself. And our eyes are flooded with light from the room, from the surroundings, from the environment. Generally, we call that ambient illumination. And the light that's flooding our retinae at the back of our eyes is also stimulating receptors that are not involved in conscious vision. They're not involved in helping us to reconstruct colors of objects and recognize them. They're involved in modulating our overall mood, behavioral level of alertness, sleep-wake cycle, and our overall behavioral and cognitive function. And these receptors are part of what we call the non-visual pathway. So we not only see light and see objects, we also feel light and respond to it in non-visual ways.
It was Professor Halbert who caused a stir a while back by posting a picture of a dress on the internet and asking people to describe its colours. Some said it was a white dress with golden lace. Others were adamant that it was a blue dress with black lace. It seems it all came down to how we respond to colours that are close to each other and to the ambient light in which we view them. My remote guests this week are the art historian Dr. Ilaria Benocchi from the University of Cambridge, and who is currently teaching at the University of Warwick, or was until lockdown, and Dunya Habash, a PhD student here at the Wolf Institute, researching the music of the Syrian diaspora. Dunya has also trained as a concert pianist in the United States. Ilaria, as an art historian, do you think about the neurological ins and outs of how we perceive colour?
Oh, yes, very much so. The funny thing is that we are used to associate colour with painting. But in fact, art historians tend to talk about coloristic and chromatic effect also when it comes to sculpture and even engraving, which is notably black and white. So when we talk about color in sculpture, we discuss the incidence of light on the surfaces that creates almost chromatics effect of chiaroscuro and light and shade and nuance. And when we discuss colorism or chromatism in engravings, of course, we tend to refer to the use of the line. So it's the funny thing is that as art historians and probably as people in general, we tend to use color and we tend to see color even where color isn't there. We tend to fill in the gaps with the language of color even when everything is in black and white. And it means that color is probably a very, very complex experience in our brain and in our act of seeing.
And when you fill in colour, presumably when you teach your students, that's something you want them to avoid, or is it something you want students to fill in themselves?
It's important that they learn to see art. It's not automatic. I think there is a training in watching art and understanding it and in being able to appreciate the way colors work, the way colors are used by painters, and also the way we should interpret them as art historians trying to make sense of these artworks. It makes me think about two funny examples from two completely different periods. One is a very, very famous painting by Titian, the Venetian painter of the 16th century, and is the Flaying of Marsyas. Marsyas is a satyr and is skinned alive because it dared to defy Apollo. And when Titian decides to paint this very gruesome scene, he actually does not depict any blood, does not paint any blood. It just adds touches of red here and there in the cloak, on the tree, in the things that are present in the scene. The effect is equally affecting, but actually there is no blood represented, but we feel the blood because there is the red. And the other thing that made me think about the strange ways in which our brain approaches color is Yves Klein, the 20th century artist who invented a completely new color called the blue Klein, which is a sort of a shade of ultramarine blue. And he tried to liberate painting and art from a narrative, even a shape. And he painted these entirely monochrome paintings with blue, and you had to just feel it and vibrate with the color. He was trying to find colors that made you vibrate along with the artwork. So these are fantastic ways in which color has been interpreted in a non-literal way over the centuries.
And Dunya, how about you? How is color interpreted in music?
Well, it's interesting, Ed. I think in recent times, and I guess Scriabin, the Russian composer of the early 20th century, was really the first one in the Western world to kind of come up with this idea that, sound can have color, because he claimed to be a synesthete. And he came up with these very intricate color scales of the different tone scales in Western harmony, basically. So, for example, for him, a C sharp had an orange tinge to it, for example. There's been a lot of research, especially in the neuroscience world, about synesthesia and trying to find what is the connection, what are the neural connections in someone's brain that would bring about these crossing of the senses. And they're discovering that a lot more people than they initially thought actually have this interesting form of synesthesia. So really it's not very common, but it is becoming more common as a way of interpreting, discussing, and being more creative, basically. I think the pop artist Lorde also has synesthesia, and she said that it helps her a lot with coming up with new ideas and composing. It's interesting because basically you see color or you see texture, and I guess it just adds to the creativity when writing music, or so a lot of composers have claimed over time.
But the same thing can happen to painters. And in fact, for instance, Vasily Kandinsky, the great abstract painter of the Blaue Reiter, insisted that his compositions were almost like concerts, and they were interpreted as such by critics from the time, from Roger Fry to all the others. He said he was inspired sometimes by Wagner. There's been connections made with the Rheingold. So funnily enough, also painters think in notes and seem to build these perfect systems, very musical systems of painting, of signs.
Is it more than language, Ilaria? In other words, I can see how some terms like building paintings in notes, or how a composer can think in artistic language, but it's one thing to use language, it's another thing to actually experience it. In other words, is it more than just a linguistic expression?
I do think so. I think it's possible. It's definitely possible. We know that it's neurologically possible. And as much as there is of course, it's difficult to say for us, to interpret for us, because we don't have the direct contact with the painter. But at the same time, we know what the painters wrote about their work and about their way of composing also in terms of art, making visual arts. And we know that we can recognize as traces of a different path, a different process that has to do more with feeling what has to go on the canvas instead of thinking it through. So it's not it's a very fine line, but I do believe it exists, and it's a possible, and it's an interpretation. And some artists like Kandinsky used it themselves, proposed it themselves.
So Dunya, you have expertise in Eastern, not just Western music. Is there some element of color in Eastern music?
I think this is interesting because a lot of the studies that have come out about synesthesia are obviously mostly based in the Western world, in the Western sciences, the Western academy. So there's, I don't know very much about, if this kind of condition has been discussed in other parts of the world. I think a lot more composers than we think actually experience this, multisensory creativity, basically. I actually have a really good friend who's a musician and back in Alabama, and he also at some point started realizing that he was seeing colors as he was making music, and then he realized that he actually does have synesthesia. So I think with very creative types, it's just natural for them, so they naturally are inclined to create more and more, and that's why probably more often than we think, composers, artists, any kind of really creative type, it's possible that they would have synesthesia, because it probably all just comes together and advances and enhances their creativity. I think Scriabin is a very interesting example because he really tried very hard to mix light with his music. And towards the end of his life, he was preparing for a piece called Mysterium, which was supposed to be this multi-sensory experience, basically, and he wanted to build a very special temple in the Himalayas, and his claim was that this would be kind of the total work of art that would involve dance, words, light, smells, music, and he hoped that would bring about the end of the world, and usher in kind of a new era for humanity. So he was very eccentric in that sense, very out there kind of a composer, was really pushing a lot of boundaries basically in musical creativity. He also, before that, wrote a piece where he wanted a light organ to accompany it. So he came up with all these colors and tried to, had a special organ built where each note had a specific color as he was seeing it in his mind. But in the premiere, they never used it because it was just way too advanced technology. And there were many other composers who would argue with him about how impossible this was, that C sharp would have a color, or that, the key of G minor is blue, or anything like that. But of course, in recent time, with the development of neuroscience and all of the studies that have come out, that has been, confirmed basically. And it's very likely that Scriabin was, in fact, a synesthete, and that did enhance his music.
I just want to move on to the question of biblical characters in art and the use of religious colour. So, for example, white is used as a colour of purity, but also death in religion. Black is the colour of sin. Red is the colour of passion, but also war, and sometimes holy war. In other words, what happens when these biblical stories are put into art? And what happens when they're translated into musical representations? Do you think about these biblical stories, the image of the resurrection of Christ, for example, or Moses on Mount Sinai, when you create music? Is there a connection, in other words, between the two?
Well, certainly there are religious figures, religious characters from the Bible, from the New Testament, for instance, that are associated with some colors. I am not sure how this could translate into music, because that's not specifically my field. But the funny thing is that there are many ways in which a character can be associated with color. A famous case is that of the Virgin Mary. We always think about the Virgin Mary with a blue cloak, is a blue mantle, that is a traditional depiction in Western art, at least. An allegorical interpretation of this color would be in fact wrong, because the reason why blue was used in that case was very, very was linked to economy. Blue was created from lapis lazuli, which were much more expensive than gold. Hence, the magnificent appearance of the Queen of Heavens had to be matched by the use of the richest hue. And the patron who commissioned works of art from painters, of course, lived of the reflected glory of having been able to pay for lapis lazuli, for all that mantle. So sometimes colors in art are linked not to interpretations or not to scripture, but are linked to very, very practical concerns like money, wealth, beauty, etc.
That's a really interesting point, Ilaria. And actually, it makes me think a little bit of kind of color symbolism in the Islamic tradition. For example, I grew up thinking or learning that the color green was a very sacred color because there's a hadith or saying of the Prophet where he claims that it's one of his, most famous colors or his favorite colors. And there's, other reasons why the color green has become so associated with like holiness in Islam. So, for example, a lot of mushafs or Qur'ans are the cover binding is usually a color green with the gold inscription on it. And it was only recently that I realized it's because of this sacred association with the color. Others claim that the Prophet used to wear a green turban, so that's another association. And there are other claims as well, because the color green is mentioned a lot in the Quran, actually. For example, descriptions of what paradise would look like, or the kind of green silk robes that people would be wearing in paradise. So all of these little details have created this kind of sacredness around the color green. So I think it's very interesting how colors can kind of take on this extra material meaning in like the daily life of worshipers as well. The color white is also symbolized with purity. So kind of like what you were saying about how the color blue has become this sacred color to represent the Virgin Mary, and similar also. So that's why in the Hajj or the pilgrimage, people are encouraged to wear white, or you're supposed to wear white towel basically if you're a man when you're going to Hajj, and it's all wrapped up in this symbolism of purity. Or if you ever have seen images of people praying at the Kaaba, most people are dressed in white dress or the white thobe, the white gown, basically, which is another symbol of kind of the Muslim worshiper.
Let's take a pause and check the doors of our perception are not too confused. You're listening to Naked Reflections with me, Ed Kessler, and my guests this week are Dunya Habash and Ilaria Bernocchi. Here's Anya Halbert again talking about the complexity of how the mind interprets visual data.
So the areas in the brain that analyze color are actually located quite close to the sort of deep-seated emotional areas of the brain. And I don't think it's any accident, therefore, that colors readily evoke intense feelings in people. Vision scientists think that there might be a link in evolution between the emotional responses that objects aroused in us and the colors that they are, so that we developed a means of using color as a sort of proxy for other properties of objects. And then we transferred those properties of objects to our feelings about the colors.
I'd like to follow up what you were saying, Dunya, before the halfway point, because the colour of green is so associated with Islam, and yet it's interesting that there's a sort of direct conflicting response, particularly amongst medieval Christians, the Crusaders, who didn't wear green deliberately because it was associated with Islam. So the reaction in Christendom was not to use green when fighting against Muslims or the Islamic enemy at that time. So there's an example of art being used in conflict or omitted in conflict, as if you're acting against something. Ilaria, what do you think?
Yeah, I was also very struck by Dunya's choice to cite precisely green and white. It made me think about the opposite of what we were discussing earlier. We discussed earlier how the choice of colors like blue that we believe has some sort of allegorical significance, in fact, was determined by different factors, very pragmatic, very matter-of-fact, everyday factors. But there is also a fascination with some colors that can be, in a way, deadly, despite material factors, and specifically with green and white, because green was a very difficult color to obtain, and for a long time it was made with arsenic. And it was an extremely poisonous color to use for painters. And the same happened with lead white, which was the most beautiful, the purest form of white, a type of white that made light, that reflected light in a very beautiful way, but there was lead in it. So for a long time, I've read somewhere once, I remember that perhaps the fact that Napoleon chose to have his room decorated with this green the fumes of this green determined his death in a way or another. So sometimes we are so in love with the emotional, perhaps visual effects of a color that we use it despite it being poisonous. And that happened precisely with green and white.
Talking of color perception, do you agree with this sense of an evolutionary explanation that Anya Hallberg offers us?
Well, personally, I know that there is a branch of history of art that in recent years, and I'm talking about the last 30, even perhaps 40 years, so quite recently, but not that recently, has been considering the use of color from a neurological point of view. It is possible, it is definitely possible that we have an instinctual response, an inbuilt neurological response to some colors. However, it is very difficult, since there are so many layers of cultural manipulation of those colors and transformation of those colors over the centuries. It's probably, a mixture of both. Of course, a completely dark painting or something that is very dark, very black, the night is pitch black, and is something we all experience and we all associate it with not knowing, not understanding, and with fear, with primal fears. So of course the use of black and of dark hues in a painting, maybe making it mostly black like in Caravaggio with just a dim light, does probably evoke some sense of mystery, some sense of unease, which could be said to be a neurological type of response built inside of us. But then art historians try to look at at an artwork as a whole, and so it's difficult to pull apart the different threads. I don't know about Dunia, what Dunia thinks about it.
It makes sense to me that given what we had to do in our surroundings, in our environments, and being just totally engulfed in the world around us, and even in today's world, it's natural. We as human beings absorb knowledge and information and ideas and thoughts, without even knowing how we're doing such things. So it makes sense that over time, yeah, we might develop certain associations. But I'm always more interested in kind of the cultural explanations for certain things, and seeing the kind of cultural history behind the development of like, take for example the Saudi Arabian flag today. It's green and white, those two colors that I was talking about, and it's precisely because of that historic Islamic association with those two colors. These kinds of ideas blend into our politics, they blend into our engagement with others and people around us. So I think you can use many different theories and explanations, but at the end of the day, it's just that it's always a debate, right?
It's interesting how it's not just the religious symbol, the crescent, the Star of David, the cross, that one associates with particular cultures or religions or lands. As you were speaking, Dunya, I was thinking of the flag of Israel, which has the Star of David, but also is in blue and white, and blue is very much associated with Judaism. In India, the red, the color of saffron, is very much associated with Hinduism and Mother India. In other words, the color itself can imply a connection with a religion or a culture, not just a symbol.
Yeah, I was just thinking about, I always try to ask the question, is it the egg or the chicken that comes first, right? So is it the fact that green was not an available color in that part of the world where Islam was born, for example? Or is it the fact that there was this mythology around the color of the clothing that the Prophet used to wear? What was it that brought forth green as such an essential symbol in Islam, whereas in Christianity or in other parts of the world, you have other colors that come to represent these things? Like, our connection to our physical environment can explain a lot of cultural symbolism that develops over time, or can explain why there are certain colors that come to represent things in our like historic and sacred mythologies. So these are the kinds of connections that always fascinate me in trying to understand who we are as human beings, as human collectivities, as these cultural imaginaries that we create over time, and where these different elements come in historically.
We're drawing towards a close, and I can't resist asking someone who's an art specialist and an art historian, someone who's a specialist in music and a concert pianist, to explain why their field is prime or why it has primacy over the other. Dunya, is music more important than art?
I think that's a difficult question. I believe that these boundaries we've created to separate creativity are just that. They're just boundaries, and really everything is much more fluid than we think. Musicians often get inspired by art and color and different things that they see, and I'm sure it's the same thing for artists as well who listen to a piece of music and have an inspiration. But I think what I love about music is how abstract it is. That sound, a collection of sounds that cultures have, developed um, uh, terminology to explain, or like in the Arab world, for example, there are microtones that don't exist in the Western musical scale, and that is meaningful to Arabs when they listen to it, and it's not necessarily the same meaning in for a Western person who's not used to associating those intervals.
So Dunya, you would be happy to be called an artist. Ilaria, would you be happy to be called a musician?
Yeah.
I would, as a neither of them. I am unfortunately neither of them, just someone who observes. But I would say that I would be happy to leave the palm of victory to music. Personally, I've always thought that music is. I could perhaps do without the visual arts, even as an art historian. I could never do without music, and I think I thought about that, and I think that music has something. There is something about the vibration of music, the fact that music is vibration, that affects our body perhaps physically in a way that is so profound, and that really creates a connection between ourselves and our environment in a way that the visual arts can't completely do. And so if I could do without seeing Titian for 30 years, I couldn't do without hearing Beethoven for 30 days.
Well, with those generous words ringing in our ears, I'd like to bring this episode to a close by thanking our guests, Dunya Khabash and Ilaria Benocchi. And thanks to you too for listening. If you'd like to get in touch with any thoughts, comments, or reflections of your own, you can email nakedreflections@wolf.cam.ac.uk. And please let us know what subjects you'd like to cover. We'd love to hear from you. In the meantime, you can find more episodes of Naked Reflections and subscribe to Naked Reflections podcast wherever you get your podcasts, or at nakedscientists.com/reflections. Do join us next time.